don't think would have made a difference to the essential decision-making.
We're coming to the end, I think, Mr. Blair, and I've got a couple of questions I'd like to raise. I think the first is to look at the perspective of the whole enterprise from the standpoint of the people of Iraq. The coalition went in as liberators. Rather soon, they began to be resented by parts of the population and then attacked as occupiers by some. By the time, for example, British forces withdrew from Basra city to the airport, 90% of the attacks there were against them, as against between members of the Shia factions. So do you think, looking back from 2010, that the people of Iraq thought that the enterprise was worthwhile? And just as one piece, not of evidence, but as a bit of anecdote, a very senior constitutional, if I can put it that way, Iraqi, said clearly it was good that Saddam has gone. But the inept nature of some of the things that the coalition did, coalition not British specifically, has caused great suffering. So the price was high.
It's too early to say right now whether the Iraqi democracy will take root and will function effectively. Although, as I think John Jenkins and Frank Baker said to you, there are really hopeful signs. And just to say some of the things that I think are taking place in Iraq today, if you look, for example, at the electricity, you look at income per head, which is several times what it was under Saddam. You look at now the money that's being spent on infrastructure. I think, yes, it was a very, very difficult fight indeed. It was always going to be difficult once these external factors came into play of AQ and Iran. But sure, when you go into a nation-building situation in the future, I think we will be far better prepared and better educated than we were then. I would just give one. If we're talking about, was it worth it in terms of the Iraqis themselves? If you look at the latest information from the Brookings Institute and the polls that they're doing about the right direction, wrong direction for their country, they're actually upbeat about the future. If you look at whether they believe that security and services are getting better, a majority of them think they are, despite all the trouble, despite the fact these terrorists carry on. Let me just give you one example of where I think you can see both the nature, since we're talking about how's it for Iraqis, because the Iraqis were themselves less worried about the issues to do with United Nations and so on. They were worried about their country and the oppression. If we just focus for a moment on what this Saddam regime was like. In 2000 and 2001 and 2002, they had a child mortality rate of 130 per 1,000 children under the age of 5, worse than the Congo. That was despite the fact that Saddam had as much money as he wanted for immunization programs and medicines for those children. That equates to roughly about 90,000 deaths under the age of 5 a year. The figure today is not 130, it's 40. That equates to about 50,000 young people, children, who is the result of a different regime that cares about its people. That's the result that getting rid of Saddam makes. And you can talk to Iraqis, of course, who will say to you, some of them, particularly those from the Sunni side, still worried about whether they'll be able to come into the politics. And some of them may say, well, I don't believe it was worth it. But I think if you ask the majority of Iraqis today, would you really prefer, with all the challenges that lie ahead, to be back under Saddam? I think you'd get a pretty overwhelming answer to that question.
The other perspective, clearly, and you will appreciate this better than anyone can probably, our participation in the Iraq conflict has been very divisive here and abroad, has caused deep anguish to those who lost people they loved, some of whom are in this room. There is gratitude, great gratitude to our armed forces for the sacrifices they made and the bravery they showed, and great sorrow at their losses. But we, like you, have also experienced at first hand the anger which is still felt by many people in this country. And we have been asking, therefore, the question, why? And so as we conclude today, can I ask what broad lessons you draw? You've drawn some already in the course of your testimony. And to say whether you have regrets about key aspects of the Iraq conflict.
I mean, I've said some of the things that I think are lessons that can be learned. About nation building, I think you've got to look very carefully at what type of forces you require, because this will be a security situation that you face, in a challenging security situation. I also think you've really got to look at the issue to do with the nature of this threat from Al-Qaeda on the one hand, Iran on the other, and the impact that that will have not just on Iraq, but potentially in different arenas right round the Middle East region and beyond. And I feel, of course, I had to take this decision as Prime Minister, and it was a huge responsibility then, and there's not a single day that passes by that I don't reflect and think about that responsibility, and so I should. But I genuinely believe that if we had left Saddam in power, even with what we know now, we would still have had to have dealt with them, possibly in circumstances where the threat was worse, and possibly in circumstances where it was hard to mobilize any support for dealing with that threat. And I think we live in a completely new security environment today. I thought that then, I think that now. It's why I've said this to you a number of times today. I take a very hard, tough line on Iran today, and many of the same arguments apply. In the end, it was divisive, and I'm sorry about that. And I tried my level best to bring people back together again. But if I'm asked whether I believe we are safer, more secure, that Iraq is better, but our own security is better, with Saddam and his two sons out of power and out of office than in office, I believe indeed that we are. And I think in time to come, if Iraq becomes, as I hope and believe that it will, the country that its people want to see, then we can look back, and in particular our armed forces can look back, with an immense sense of pride and achievement in what they did.
And no regrets?
Responsibility, but not a regret for removing Saddam Hussein. I think he was
Be quiet, please.
I think that he was a monster. I believe he threatened not just the region, but the world. And in the circumstances that we faced then, but I think even if you look back now, it was better to deal with this threat, to deal with it, to remove him from office. And I do genuinely believe that the world is safer as a result. And I know sometimes, because this happens out in the region, sometimes people will say to me, well, Saddam was a brake on Iran. You know, let's be clear, there's another view of foreign policy in this instance, which is the way, if we left Saddam in place, he would have controlled Iran better. I really think it's time we learnt, as a matter of sensible foreign policy, that the way to deal with one dictatorial threat is not to back another. That actually the best answer to what is happening in Iran is to allow the Iraqi people the freedom and democratic choice that we enjoy in countries like ours.
Thank you. This brings us, I think, to the end of today's hearings. Is there any final comment beyond those you've already made that you would wish to add before we close?
No.
In that case, can I say two things? The first is that there clearly are considerable limits to what we can cover in one day. The inquiry still has much work to do. And among other things, our witness today, Mr. Blair, has drawn attention to a number of dimensions arising out of Iran and its behaviour, which I think we shall want to pursue. Can I, with that, thank our witness for a long day of testimony, a long, hard day, I think, and thank very much those of you who have been here as witnesses to this session, as to those who were present in the morning session. Thank you all very much indeed. Now, with that, we'll resume hearings next week on Monday at 11 o'clock in the morning, and later on, in late February or early March, we'll be taking testimony from the Prime Minister, from Mr. Gordon Brown, and other senior ministers, perhaps. So, with that, we close this session. Thank you all again.
You're watching Sky News live at 5. It's 10 minutes past 5, and you see Tony Blair leaving the Iraq inquiry after the most dramatic day of evidence so far, the day they've been calling Blair's Judgment Day. At the end of it, though, to perhaps draw a conclusion to what he had to say over a 6-hour period to the Chilcot Inquiry today, perhaps it could be summed up that he had no regrets, he made no apologies, he showed no great contrition. He was sorry only that it was divisive in its nature, calling the war in Iraq. And at the end of it, he appeared to emerge, as he always has been, a true believer in the invasion of Iraq. A man who said that he believed in his own judgment he had taken the right decision. And really throughout that 6 hours of testimony today, he remained pretty unwavering and unshakable in that belief, whatever the justification for it. And he was cross-questioned, interrogated time and time again by the panel on the Chilcot Inquiry into his justifications for it. We'll look at those in more detail later. Whether what he's had to say will satisfy those with doubts about the war and doubts about the justification, well, the crowd of Stop the War Coalition protesters, those that have been against Blair and going to war from the very start, have been here all day in quite sizable numbers, a few dozen at times, up to a couple of hundred at other times, have been very vocal in their protests, and they are tonight still waving their placards and calling to talk to Blair, calling in a way for some conclusion that they don't believe this inquiry has yet found for them. Not only people who are against the war, but of course many of the bereaved, the families of those who have died, the 179 service personnel who died during the course of the invasion, the war in Iraq and the occupation by British forces there. We shall talk to all sides over this and get some reaction from families, reaction from politicians, reaction from those who were involved in the decision-making process themselves, those who opposed Tony Blair, to see what they think of it at the end of it. Let's bring in our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Tim Marshall, though, who's been following it all day. How much did you learn today that was new, and did you see any variations on the Blair theme?
I thought it was going over all the old ground, but in a way I think we needed to hear from the former Prime Minister. I thought the last 10 minutes was electric. It was electric political theatre, and it was also a very personal, emotional moment, I thought, for Mr. Blair. He was given the platform. Mr. Chilcot basically said to him, here is your chance to sum up, and Mr. Blair seized it because this is his last chance. There's not going to be any more inquiries. And in it, he crystallised what he spent the whole day doing, setting out the post-9/11 thinking. Most people say there's no connection between Iraq and 9/11, and they're right, but he made the intellectual connection. If a man with WMD, which he believed he had, gets together with Al-Qaeda, there'll be 300,000 deaths, not just the 3,000 of the Twin Towers. That was the basis for where he then moved. He then went on to the legality of Resolution 1441, gave his reasons for saying why he believes that material breach was in the legal language of 1441, consequently it was all legal. And then right at the end, Jeremy, that electric moment where he was asked, any regrets? He was asked 3 times, any regrets? And no, he doesn't have them. Mr. Blair believes he did the right thing. I don't think he was probed hard enough on his language and where his core beliefs came from. And I think people will see this as a missed opportunity. Nevertheless, it was an amazing day of political theatre.
And as we've just been hearing, he was not only heckled in those last dramatic moments when he was summing up his thoughts inside, but he was, there were shouts from the crowd as they believed they were seeing him leaving. Some of the protesters here calling him a liar and a murderer, a belief that many of them have had all the way along. I mean, there are those, of course, here amongst the anti-war protesters who believe that he should stand in a war crimes trial at some stage, although nothing in the evidence of this inquiry so far has suggested that that is likely to come about. But very strong feelings here amongst these protesters who've been out there on the pavement since first light this morning to make sure that their views are not forgotten. Many of them would have liked to have met Tony Blair face to face. It's something that he has time and again refused to do. We're waiting to see the departures now. Many of the people who were inside there, including not only general members of the public as observers, but also members of the families. They drew lots to allow them to go in there, somewhere between 20 and 30 members of families who were bereaved by the Iraq conflict have been in there on a rotation basis, and it's believed that the heckling towards the end there, aimed at Tony Blair, came from the ranks of those people. So we're keeping an eye out for those people leaving. We're going to be talking to some of those fairly shortly. We're also going to be keeping an eye out for the members of the panel themselves, and of course Tony Blair, who we know first thing this morning around 7:30 slipped in undetected through a back entrance into the Queen Elizabeth II Centre here. The question is, will he come out the main door tonight or not? Tim Marshall's here with me.
They split into four, the couple of hundred protesters, about 50 on each corner with placards, and they were saying through the megaphones earlier today that they want to make absolutely sure that whichever entrance Mr. Blair leaves from, he sees their placards calling him a liar. They've been calling for him to go to the Hague War Crimes Tribunal. That's simply not going to happen. But they feel the opposite of what Mr. Blair said at the end. They believe that history will judge him utterly wrong. He believes, as he summed up in those last dramatic minutes, he believes history will judge him ultimately correct. But they're on all four corners, and they just want to make sure that they get the chance to shout at him, show him the placards, and they were saying they will haunt him until he goes to his grave.
The only way, presumably legally, he could be taken to the Hague to stand as a charged war criminal on allegations of war crime would be if there had been an absolutely decisive case made against this war being legal. And one has to say, listening to it over the months, and particularly this very crucial week, this week, when Foreign Office lawyers themselves, who were opposed to the Blair straw view, it comes down to a matter of legal interpretation rather than a clear-cut case, doesn't it?
You might take the view that Lord Goldsmith was lent on and therefore changed his advice, something he denies. Even if you did take that view, the legal advice to the UK government was that the war would be legal. 1441 paragraph 1 says Iraq is already in material breach. Paragraph 3 says if they don't cooperate they'll be in further material breach. You can take the view that is legal. Other people say no, it wasn't. The other problem with a war crimes tribunal, well, there's two more problems. One, legislation will probably go through in the UK to prevent British politicians being charged with such things. And also, it is quite probable that international law is about the conduct during the war, not the decision to go to war. And consequently, as the British troops are regarded as behaving within the rules of law and the rules of war, you couldn't send him to The Hague on that as well. So that is a minority opinion being expressed, but they're expressing it very volubly.
We're just keeping an eye, as you can see from our pictures there, the split screen here around the QE2 Centre, we're keeping an eye on, as Tim was describing to us, the four corners of the QE2 Centre where the different protest groups have been broken up into, and we can see what sort of action is going on there. As said, the crowd still calling out liar and murderer aimed at Tony Blair. As they wait for him to leave, we're keeping an eye on the entrances to see if we can see him departing and get an idea of the reaction. We can imagine what that's going to be. Inside, of course, it was a much more sedate affair over that 6 hours of quizzing and interrogation by the panel, all very good-natured. There were no raised voices there today. just the heckling from one of the observers towards the end, as Tony Blair was asked whether he had any regrets, and he said no regrets about the war. The only regret he had was that it had been so divisive. Our political editor Adam Bolton joins me. He's been listening to it all inside. Your thoughts, Adam?
Well, I should just say, Jeremy, I think after the cameras were switched up, a little bit more heckling. Just as Mr. Blair was leaving the room, a couple of people booed, and then there were shouts of you are a murderer, you are a liar, or you are a liar and a murderer. And I think it was pretty clear from a couple of bursts of laughter during the afternoon that certainly those people who feel passionately against the war weren't very impressed by what they heard this afternoon. I also got the impression, I think, that Mr. Blair wasn't really enjoying himself at all. That's actually the young man down there who shouted, "Come on." I think he's going to come up and tell us why in a minute. He spent some time in Syria. And he didn't enjoy the afternoon. I felt his face fell in rather, and really in three areas. He didn't get any support at all from the panel. You know, first of all, we had Baroness Pritchard, who had several goes talking about the preparations for the conflict, and she said, well, you know, were preparations adequate? And Mr. Blair tried to answer that. We then had the chairman, Sir John Chilcot, weighing in, said that there was no real risk analysis that was carried out, and then a pretty devastating cross-examination about what happened in Iraq after the war from Lawrence Freedman, basically saying that there was a lack of planning and a cavalier attitude on behalf of the Americans, which left a very heavy price to pay in terms of civilian deaths. And then finally, that session at the end, again with Baroness Pritchard and Sir John Chilcot joining in, again asking Mr. Blair if he had any regrets, and he said no, responsibility, I take responsibility, but he wouldn't use the word regret in spite of a lot of mention of the civilian casualties and the consequences, and that is when certainly one or two of his audience appeared to lose their tempers with him. So I think quite a difficult session. It certainly suggests that in answering this question of why did we go to war, why Saddam Hussein, why 2003, that this committee at least is going to air the grievances of the sort of people who are here protesting, even if it doesn't fully endorse them.
In a way, though, I suppose it may well be as good as it gets for those who are anything from sceptical to downright mad as hell about the war.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some very obvious questions which weren't asked today. Why wasn't the Prime Minister asked, in effect, at the time, didn't you mislead Parliament when you talked about weapons of mass destruction? Why wasn't the Prime Minister asked in so many words if he had put pressure on the Attorney General to come up with a legal opinion, change his mind, and come up with a legal opinion that justified war? He wasn't asked at any point really about what had gone on between him and George Bush in terms of undertakings or commitments to go to war. So that's why, again, a lot of critics of the war will say they're very unsatisfied by this hearing today.
I mean, would it be fair to say that if the panel of Sir John Chilcot's panel had landed any blows at all, it was really about the area of post-invasion rather than the reasons for going to war and the legality?
I think those were certainly the heaviest blows, and also the very strong suggestion that Britain wasn't being consulted about key decisions, the de-Baathification policy, dismantling the army, wasn't informed in advance about the shock of Abu Ghraib that was going to break out, didn't really have enough troops on the ground to maintain security. I think that was probably the most damaging area of responsibility, if you like, for Mr. Blair. At the same time, on the pre-war stuff, you know, there are one or two phrases which I think will be remembered. Roderick Lyne saying that Mr. Blair is constructing a scenario built up of a lot of ifs, or Sir Lawrence Freedman saying, when you say beyond doubt, is that your doubt or anybody else's doubt? I mean, there were clear signs there, I think, of impatience. And Mr. Blair tried again and again and again to build up this scenario of, you should ask the 2010 question. If we hadn't done this, Saddam Hussein would be there competing with the Iraqis, with the Iranians, to get nuclear weapons and unite with Al-Qaeda. And Sir Roderick Lyne, the Foreign Office boffin, just said, well, there is another scenario that he might just still be contained at this level. So I think that the vision of I did what in my heart was right and it was in Britain's interest was certainly contested in the tenor of the questions.
Just to remind you, you're watching Sky News live at 5. It's 25 past 5. It's about 15 minutes now since Tony Blair got up after 6 hours of cross-questioning and quizzing and interrogation inside the Iraq Inquiry here at the Queen Elizabeth II Centre in the heart of Westminster, and headed for the ante-rooms. We're still keeping an eye on two of the main exits there to see whether we can see him leaving the building. Adam Bolton, our political editor, who was sitting in there at the end, said that after the cameras were switched off, Tony Blair was heckled and jeered by some of those who were sitting in the public gallery area, who called him a liar and a murderer and said, come on, and certainly questioned when he said he had no regrets about the war, only responsibilities, and suggesting that throughout the day he had been firm on his stand, that he had felt that he had always taken the right decision on Iraq. We'll be keeping an eye on those exits. We'll be talking to some of the people who were inside there, and keeping an eye on the protests, the Stop the War Coalition protesters outside, who are on four corners of this large building near Westminster Abbey, in the heart of Westminster itself. Adam Bolton, our political editor, again watching all this. Adam, a lot of people have raised this question about how tougher an inquisitorial arena this has been, and whether the panel have let some of those sitting in front of them off lightly. What's your feeling about that? I mean, the way I felt that today they hadn't allowed Tony Blair to grandstand. They'd sort of kept him under pretty good check, and they'd chivied him along with their questions. Did they, do you think, they may not have asked every question that everybody would have wanted, but on the whole gave a good account of themselves?
Yeah, I would have to say I'm not one of those who disparage this panel. I mean, we have to remember this is called the Iraq Inquiry, not the Iraq trial. And therefore, in the end, they're going to go beyond black and white of he did that and it was all his fault, towards saying, well, perhaps this should have been done better. There are lessons to be learned. Perhaps the government fell down in this area. And so those people who want to criticise Tony Blair, who are unhappy with the way the government handled this, I would be surprised if, when the report finally comes out, they don't find at least some level of criticism of what went on, and also a clear expression of the dreadful consequences of the decision to go to war. However, those people who would like to see Tony Blair in the dock for war crimes, kind of maybe, according to opinion polls, 20% of the British population, they are going to be dissatisfied, because in the end, it's emerged from the questioning by historians and by civil servants effectively on this panel that they understand that this is the sort of thing that happens in the end. It may be messy, people may feel passionately about it, and therefore they're trying to get into the entrails of it rather than necessarily point the finger.
I mean, at the end of today's 6 hours, you're reminded in a way not only what a divisive figure Tony Blair is, but also perhaps what a compelling figure he is. And that, do you feel at the end of the day that anybody will have been persuaded from the original view they started with before he gave testimony this morning?
I think Tony Blair may look back on this and feel that he missed an opportunity to rehabilitate himself at the end. One can quite understand, with hindsight, why at the Hutton inquiry he wouldn't express regrets. But here, in this context, where we know by his own admission at least 100,000 Iraqis died, British soldiers died, clearly in most people's view, including the panel, mistakes were made, it might, if he wanted to re-established himself as the popular figure that he was for so long in his political career, it might have been a move for him to say, yes, perhaps I got one or two things wrong.
But don't you
in
think
the end, that wasn't what he was prepared to do?
But don't you think that everybody on this subject, almost everybody, has such trenchant views one way or another that it would be very hard. He'd have to do an awful lot to persuade anybody to cross the line and